Welcome back, everyone, to episode 16 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is our trip through all the basics of ancient Mesopotamia by A. Leo Oppenheim. Today we are in part 2 of Mesopotamian religion. We're looking at the care and feeding of the gods. So we're going to begin by identifying some of the biases that we need to watch out for as we approach this topic. Then think about the role of the cult statue, or the idol, as it were. And then finally, its creation and indwelling. And once we can get these three things under our belt, then we can actually see why it is that these statues, these gods, needed to be cared for. So some of the biases that we need to watch out for that Oppenheim points out. First of all, idols and idolatry are heavily weighted terms. So when we think about idols, we think about passages, for example, from the Old Testament and how wicked and awful they are, and those sorts of things can make us think very poorly of them, or maybe even shy away from them in general, simply because of the negative connotation of that term idol or idolatry. Secondly, in our modern understanding of how science works and how the world around us works, it can be difficult to see a cultic statue or an idol through the eyes of a worshiper. And that's something that's really important to try to do as much as possible, to understand how that cult statue functioned and what it meant, is to be able to see it through the worshiper's eyes, if at all possible. Finally, there can be this idea of general disregard for cultic statues, not just because of the term idolatry or idol, but also because the ones in Mesopotamia are kind of boring, right? I mean, they're a normal shape, they have a rather plain appearance, and so it's not this big flashy thing that draws our attention. So we need to just be careful when we come to the study of the cultic statue and the rituals that go on around it, that we keep these biases in mind. Okay. What was the role of the cultic statue? The cultic statue was central to worship in Mesopotamia. We see this in the centrality of the worship of the cult statue in the temple. There's a temple in every city. And the presence of cheap replicas of these cultic statues in residential contexts. The statue functioned in two primary ways in and around the temple. First, there was a more stationary function in the temple. So it was in the temple, and there were sacrificial and care and feeding rituals that were performed around it and to it. But then there was this more mobile role or function that the cult statue served, and that was internal and external processions and ceremonies that were connected with the temple and the city. And so you see the cultic statue sitting in place and having rituals done to it and around it, and you see it going on procession and participating in ceremonies, and in every case, the god remains with the statue. Let's talk about the creation and the indwelling of these cult statues. So most statues were made of precious wood. There were some, depending on the context, that were plated in gold. They were adorned with various garments, types of clothing, and accoutrement. And this would include tiaras or any number of things. It is important to remember that the deity was essentially present in the statues. So when the cult statue was in place, the god was there. When the cult statue moved, the god went with it. And so when a cult statue went into captivity, when the city was conquered and the statue was taken away, the god went with it. Gods could, however, at the same time exist in the statue and move about in the mythological cosmic realm. That's important to remember. There were two primary criticisms of idols, and I'm thinking specifically here of the Old Testament, and they were, although human in form, they can't really do anything, right? They can't do the things that humans do, like see and hear and walk and talk. They were just dumb idols. In addition, the prophet said, these statues, you made them, right? These idols, you created them, and now you're worshiping them. Interestingly enough, and we have a video about this, so I won't go into any detail about it here, but there were a number of rituals that would allow those that created quote unquote, the cult statute to actually say, no, we didn't. The gods did. And there were a number of rituals that were performed in order to make that a reality in their religious context. So statues were created in sacred temple workshops, and they were subjected to what I'm calling the enlivening rituals. So the Mies P, to name one, but there are others. But please see our video on how cult statues were created and brought to life by the gods. So, in summation, we need to ensure that when we approach a study of the cult and cult statues, that we set aside these biases that we might have when we think about things like idols, right? Because that can have a very negative connotation. Cultic statues played a central role in worship, both in place and on the go, in the procession. And finally, although the statues were relatively simple and plain, statues were believed to be made by the gods and indwelled with the essence of the god. This would lead to the requirement of care and feeding, because if the god was present in the statue, the belief was that the god needed to be fed and clothed and cared for. So, in the next video, we will take up part 2 of the care and feeding of the gods and talk about some of the specifics of how these cultic statues were cared for. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?